Flannery O'Connor is one of America's greatest Christian writers. Some would say the greatest. But reading O'Connor is not a walk in the park. Her frightening and often violent vision of the world forces readers to consider belief in God, the reality of evil, and our own moral backwardness. Cormac McCarthy was hugely influenced by her work. She once wrote that the truth doesn't change according to our ability to stomach it. She incisively saw that our modern age is blind to truth and brings us to a head-on collision with the good and evil within ourselves. I know of no other writer of fiction that so effectively confronts the secular delusion that God is dead than Flannery O'Connor. So this week, I was honored to speak with Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson of John Brown University, where she teaches literature and creative writing. And Dr. Wilson has written extensively on the works of Flannery O'Connor, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Walker Percy. And right now, she's actually preparing O'Connor's unfinished novel for publication. I spoke with her about Flannery's legacy and what wisdom her work offers us in today's cultural landscape. Here's that conversation. All right, so for anyone familiar with the name Flannery O'Connor, but not so much her work, who was she and why is she considered one of America's greatest Christian writers, if not the greatest?
Flannery O'Connor is not only canonized in the American canon, but also as a Christian writer, she was delivering us truth, and she was invested in the Word. She was reading the Bible every day. She actually said the world would be a better place if everyone read their newspaper and their Bible every day. And so she's one of those Orthodox Christian writers, not just one who's Christian in name and not in practice. So if you look at the American tradition, you have Emerson, not really Christian. You have lots of writers who kind of are more heretical than they are Christian, but O'Connor's not that way. You can feel safe and unsafe in reading her work.
Sure. So you've written quite a lot on Flannery O'Connor, but I've been reading your book, Giving the Devil His Due, which is kind of about the use of the demonic in her writing,
Yes.
which does not sound like a fun subject, but kind of break that down a little bit for us, because something that she said about her own work is that it's about the action of grace and territory largely held by the devil. Sounds like a loaded statement.
Well, I think the problem is that most people don't want to admit that the demonic is there, or if they have a belief in the demonic, they have kind of a pseudo belief or a false understanding of what the demonic looks like in reality. So you have a caricature of a demon with horns and a tail instead of the true demonic, which is a parasite that's going to feed off of your nature to move you further and further away from God's image and more towards nothingness and nihilism. And O'Connor is instead exposing that devil that possesses us. And then she's giving us grace in her stories. She's giving us the option to turn away once we've seen the veil removed and we've seen what the demonic is, and to turn away, reject it, and move towards God and move back towards Christ.
So you've called kind of this modern delusion, I guess, the idea that God is dead, or the idea that we are now, I guess, inherit the deism of God, that we're now our own gods. You've called that kind of the great delusion of modernity, and that's something that O'Connor really kind of honed in on. How did she go about doing that and confronting that for readers?
If you read her second novel, it's called The Violent Bear It Away. And in the novel, you have this 14-year-old boy who has been raised as a Christian by his grandfather or his great uncle, and his great uncle passes away. And now it's left up to the boy, do I follow my great uncle's example, or do I go and live in a different way? And inside his head, you hear a voice, and the voice says, no, no, no. It's not whether you follow Jesus like your great uncle taught you, or you follow the devil. There is no such thing as the devil. It's Jesus or you. And there you see the lie exposed. This idea that being yourself is really the other opportunity, as opposed to the religious confinement that God gives us, the enslavement that appears in Christianity, when in fact you're actually being enslaved by the devil unaware when you follow yourself and when you are your own autonomous person. It's impossible for anyone to be themselves. I mean, you were created even in the image of your parents when you're birthed into the world. And even more so, Scripture reveals to us that we were created originally in God's image, and even tainted by the fall, that we're supposed to return to that image by following Christ and imitating him. So by nature, we are imitative creatures. And if we deny that, we end up falling to influences we didn't choose.
That's a good point, because that's definitely something that we are now kind of told everywhere, is that you should be yourself. And what does that really mean? And yet, O'Connor spoke about the world, or the South in particular, being Christ haunted. That there was this reality, this level of existence that we can't really escape, even though we want to believe we can.
Yes, and that we shouldn't want to. I mean, I think that we desire to escape from it because of a false understanding of what it is. And Graham Greene, who is one of her contemporaries, he writes this story about this priest who is constantly running from the law. And the law confronts him and says, you're God, and your God is love. It just seems like a poor excuse for a God and poor excuse for love. And Graham Greene's character says, no, it's actually a very fearful and real God. It is a God who can raise people out of their graves and set fire to bushes. And I'm running always from that God because that God is scary, but in a good way, right? It's the lion in C.S. Lewis. It's the tame. It's not a tame lion, right? It's wild and ferocious, and yet it is love at the same time. And you see that in O'Connor's work. She's growing out of the same tradition in which Christ is stalking characters from behind trees, and it's a stalking, mad, raving figure that we no longer recognize and that we're afraid of. And yet it is the God that's always chasing us and pursuing us, and that we want to keep pursuing us for our own good and for our own safety.
Yeah. So a lot of readers, I love O'Connor, but a lot of folks that I say, hey, you should go read her, they read O'Connor and they're repulsed. Or, we talk about scary and frightening elements. I mean, her literature is just chock full of just all of that stuff.
Yes.
What is she doing in that, and how do you reconcile that with her faith?
I think too often we assume that God is nice because God is love, and that we assume that Christ is safe because Christ is good. And in O'Connor's world, we cannot become complacent to that. You have lots of religious figures in her work. For example, you have Mrs. May, who was a good Christian, though, of course, she did not believe any of it was true. And you have all of these complacent Christians who are safe in their own self-righteousness and not confronting the Christ who is in the Gospels. And O'Connor reconnects us with that Christ, the Christ who is there, who demands more of us, who scandalizes us into a life that doesn't look like the world's and doesn't look like everyone else's. And O'Connor reminds us that there is no safe, lukewarm humanism that we can turn to, that if we are believers in the gospel, it's a matter of life and death. And there's nothing we can do, one of her characters says, but throw down everything and follow Jesus if it's true. There's just nothing else to do.
Yeah, that kind of hard black and white truth doesn't resonate that well in a modern age that wants to believe in a lot of gray areas.
Right.
And I feel like, a lot of people, when they think of fiction, they think of something that it just really tells us stories that validate kind of the way the world is as we see it. And maybe it's a beach read, or maybe it's something else. And that's maybe different from reality. Fiction is over here, reality is over here. But O'Connor didn't see it that way. Tell us a little bit about how she saw the two as being connected in a very important way.
When O'Connor was in graduate school at the University of Iowa, she was in an MFA program, and she has this prayer journal that I recommend to everyone to read. And she writes to God, she says, please help me to get deep down to where you are. And so she saw writing as this portal to be able to pull away the empirical world, the visible world, to kind of go underneath it, to find the truth that's truer than fact, that's truer than our senses, the spiritual reality. And she wanted her stories to go there, to go through the particularity of our times and place, to access the universal and timeless. And that's what her stories do. And that's sometimes why they're uncomfortable, because they don't allow us to see ourselves as we want to see ourselves, but they show us who we are. She said that good fiction, or a good novelist, had to be both a mirror and a judge. That it doesn't just show us who we want to be, it shows us who we are, who we have been, and then judges us about whether or not we're going to be good in that place or not.
And she kind of confronts readers with a choice about how they respond to her stories, right?
Yes, I mean, in her stories, every single character has a moment of grace, has that moment of choosing to the left is Jesus, or to the right is Jesus, and to the left is following yourself, which will eventually lead towards violence. It'll be following the demonic. It is a path towards nothingness in her fiction. And she always allows that moment of grace. And thus, as readers, we vicariously receive a moment of grace in the stories.
Let me ask you this. You have called her stories, and maybe this is an original term, tell me if not, but you've called them incarnational in form. What do you mean by that?
Well, and it's not original to me, but I'm thinking it's Christina Bieber Lake writes a book on the incarnational art of Flannery O'Connor, and Susan Srigley writes the sacramental art of Flannery O'Connor. But it's also a term that can be applied toward Dostoevsky, towards Walker Percy, to all of those writers who believe that they need to humble themselves before the art, and when they are writing, to write with the mindset of God, and try to bring people. It's almost like proselytizing fiction without propaganda, right? How do you have art that transforms people and doesn't just preach a message?
Right.
So they don't want their art to be didactic. They want it to be an experience of the truth of the gospel. And so incarnational means that when you are living in the world of their stories, you are in a heightened reality. You're in a world that understands the spiritual consequences of your daily actions. So in O'Connor's stories, moments that appear small, right, whether someone holds out their hand to a character or whether someone shoots a character, in fact, those moments are whether or not you've rejected God or accepted God. They become heightened in their awareness in the fiction.
I feel like that's the tension today with often you get, I mean, I hate to say it, but a lot of so-called Christian movies, they're just bad stories, right? Because it just feels like moralism or kind of like an Aesop's fable. Like, I don't just, it feels like you have sacrificed the art for the sake of, like you said, didactic messaging. And O'Connor and others were looking for something that actually really elevated both.
What you have in the Christian worldview, you do not have in any other worldview. You have a God who is so in tune with stories because he is the creator and author of the story of existence, who then enters the story in a particular time and place as a particular person. So you also have the story of Jesus Christ, the beginning, middle, and end. So, and gives us revelation in his book, which is a story. It is not a list of to-dos and don'ts and rituals.
Absolutely.
The rituals are all within a context of story. Russell Moore, even earlier this year, wrote a piece called "You Can't Have Ethics Without Stories." And he talks about even the 10 Commandments are within the narrative, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery, out of Egypt. So we have a God who teaches who he is through story, not through principles, not through a didactic list of dictums. And so we have these writers that if you imitate the God who authored the world, if you imitate the God who entered the world as Jesus Christ, if you're having that kind of imitation in your art, then you don't have to reduce your art to an Aesop's fable. Instead, you can imitate the world around you and write a story the way that God's writing stories. And that very experience for your reader will teach them more about who God is.
I think that's a great point. I'd love to see more of that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'd love to see more of that. You know, that reminds me of something that Flannery wrote once. She said, you know, in the long run, a people is known not by its statements or statistics, but by the stories it tells.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely the case. And
absolutely.
It's just an echo of what you've been saying.
Well, N.T. Wright says that too. He says when Jesus tells us how to be in the world, Jesus doesn't say do this and do that. He says follow me. So inhabit a character or a life or your own story in such a way that it imitates Jesus's story.
Right.
It's just phenomenally different.
So this kind of modern thing called moralistic therapeutic deism, this idea that you're just teaching you good ways to live in the world, that doesn't really cut it in the end, right? That doesn't have the rich story behind it. Right,
which is also why as Christians you have to be invested in stories. You have to be reading stories in order to start transforming your character. I mean, we're supposed to be embodied words the way that Jesus is. And therefore, the more time we invest and spend in words, right, as well as the word,
right,
the more that we're going to be living out that calling.
Right. I mean, I feel like we are obviously, we're driven, we're wired for story, and we are living a story. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we read, the stories we imitate.
Right.
So obviously, reading O'Connor is a great place to start with that.
Yes.
Others,
the Christian vocation is supposed to be a life of reading stories.
Well, let me ask you this, just as maybe a next to last question here. For in today's world, and obviously I think all of this has application today, but what wisdom might O'Connor offer today's cultural landscape where we are right now, and what challenges would she leave us?
I don't think it would be any different than what she did in the 1960s. And the reason why is because she was invested in what was timeless and universal. So even though she's writing about particularities of her culture, she's trying to get down underneath things so that her stories last, in the same way that you can read Shakespeare and you can understand the application to now.
Right.
Because it's not a matter of headlines or what's happening in current events. What's happening in current events is all a matter of sin and poor choices. And I think each person is always confronting their own sin, their own pride. For O'Connor, all of her characters are brought to a place of self-knowledge. And what she says is that self-knowledge is discovering how much you lack. And that's the starting point. So all her stories vicariously bring people to a recognition of who they are, which is understanding how much you lack. And that beginning and then seeing how full God is changes each person. So it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about right now or 100 years from now. It's going to be the same problem for people.
Right. And that really speaks to her legacy, that she was able to find the timeless. And that probably offers a good commentary on today's kind of headline-driven culture, to say, we need to get to the depths here, not just the shallows.
Right. She's prophetic in that sense because she has this long-term vision of what's eternal. And the ways in which the eternal touches our moments here and now matter, but it's not going to change in the deepest way from what's going to happen in 100 years.
Right. Well, I know we only have so much time, so let me just ask this. For those that maybe have tried reading O'Connor before and found her somewhat inaccessible, not really knowing what's going on, or for those that have never read O'Connor, where's a good place to start?
Start with her story, Revelation. Revelation was her last story that she wrote. She was in the hospital bed. She's dying of lupus at 39. And she said that it was the fastest story she ever wrote. She wrote it very quickly. It just seemed an inspired story to her. It's a great place to start. Nobody dies at the end.
There we go.
The revelation comes and the character has the opportunity to choose where they walk after the moment of revelation. And so it's a beautiful starting place. I think that anybody who has difficulty with O'Connor can start there and understand what it is that she's doing by confronting this character with who this character is, Ruby Turpin, and who God is in the story. And once you kind of understand that that's what O'Connor's doing in every story, then you can go back to her other stories and say, okay, how is God meeting this character in this story? And what does God want to reveal about himself and about who this character is? Excellent.
Well, where can folks find you and your writings online?
Sure. If you go to www.jessicahootenwilson.com, I'm always uncomfortable that my name is a website, but I do want to give people access to me because I am a teacher at heart and I love to answer questions and to meet people. And if it has to be virtual, then that's the way it has to be. But you can meet me through my website. You can also look at my books. They're on Amazon. I've written 2 on Walker Percy and 1 on O'Connor. So, and I would love to continue this.
You have 1 upcoming? Am I wrong in that?
I am working on a project right now on O'Connor. So another one. So
I was thinking of you had a Percy book that was coming. Is it already published?
It is April. Yes.
Right now. This month. Fabulous. Well, there we go.
Right.
All right. New. Well, I hope it is received very well.
Thank you.
To mention your final project, because this is of great interest to me. You are working on compiling Flannery's unfinished 3rd novel for publication, right?
Yes. Can it be done? So,
wait, is there a timeline on this? That I can't wait.
Well, it's always a matter of how it's working out. It's an unfinished form, so we've got to figure out what the best way of putting it forward would be, and giving people access to the material. And making sure to uphold the high standards of O'Connor's legacy with something that she didn't have a chance to revise. So
absolutely.
So we'll see.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for your time. Thanks for answering my questions. And I really, really appreciate it.